So I will examine how William James's positions as a pragmatic philosopher helped him to kind of spawn American psychology, with particular attention to his stance on the mind-body problem. And in many ways, James's pragmatism entailed breaking the metaphysical straitjackets that had put many other sciences on questionable footing, led them astray, or directed them to dead ends. So James acted as a kind of trickster, in a way, presenting the possibility of a Houdini breakout from the stalemate. He's often considered the father of American psychology, deeply influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, particularly by what is known as functionalism. So the core idea is, do not ask what a phenomenon is. That's hopeless to answer. Ask instead what a phenomenon does. That enables you to study determinants, correlates, consequences, and in that way you have a more stable footing to try to rein the phenomenon in. So this is decidedly a pragmatic attitude towards knowledge and science. It's also expressed in James's advocacy for methodological pluralism, his interest in mystical experiences, and his own particular and quite original take on the mind-body problem, which I will get to shortly. But first, let's say a few words about William James the man, well-dressed. He's born in 1842, raised in an extremely wealthy, intellectually renowned and deeply dysfunctional Boston family. His father is a famous theologian, actually Swedenborgian, and his bigger brother Henry is America's most famous novelist at the time. Young William gets a broad transatlantic education, and he takes particular inspiration from the German post-Enlightenment romantics that we heard about earlier. He is expected by his family to become an honorable medical doctor, and he does pursue a career in physiology, but he gradually becomes increasingly disenchanted with that discipline. Instead, he moves into philosophy, and he develops a particular interest in questions about the human mind. To make matters worse, he becomes a pacifist and gets into theosophy and parapsychology. So all of this makes him a black sheep in his family. That James was later to become one of the greatest intellectuals in American history didn't do much to help him at the time. Nonetheless, he's foundational in developing the first psychology department at Harvard University in the late 1800s. Teaching psychology was no easy task because there wasn't much scientific literature on the human mind to teach from. So here James famously notes, quote, "The first lecture on psychology I ever heard was the first I ever gave," end of quote. So he takes upon himself to write the first major American volumes on psychology, which are known as the Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. And it's hard to overstate the importance of that work. It has, for example, more than 60,000 citations. But that book is a little bit dull, I think, compared to some of the stuff that he wrote in philosophy, and especially compared to what I think is his major masterpiece, which he wrote towards the end of his life, The Varieties of Religious Experience, which was published in 1902, and James died 8 years later in 1910. There are lots of similarities between Charles Darwin and William James. Functionalism is one of them. Another one is that, like Darwin, James suffered from ill health throughout much of his adult life, both physically and mentally. He had repeated debilitating periods of depression. He was also diagnosed with neurasthenia, which was the term for burnout syndrome, more or less. He was even suicidal at times, bedridden for long periods. Rumors has it that he arose from his bed one day, following such a period, and he immediately started working intensely on the varieties of religious experience. And with that book, he founds the psychology of religion and writes the most important text ever in that discipline, which has been cited more than 25,000 times. And again, like Darwin, he makes numerous serious attempts to understand and cure his own suffering, without much help, it seems. One of the attempts at cure, which also enabled him to learn more about altered states of consciousness, was to build his very own laughing gas chamber. He reportedly spent much time in it. One day in the chamber, he finally came to understand Hegel's philosophy. His dialectics in particular had been very hard to grasp for James prior to that. Given his broad intellectual education, James had, of course, been confronted by a number of competing ideas on how to understand the human mind and its relation to the body, including the brain. From a natural science perspective, physiology included, of course, came the idea that mind is really matter, just expressed with other words, like experience, soul, idea, consciousness, intention. And those words do not deserve inclusion in a proper natural science that is built on materialism as the kind of operating agenda. Yet the world of humans naturally reeks of mind data, and such data seems profoundly important to help to distinguish humans from other properties and organisms of the natural world. So they would seem worthy of inclusion in a science that is developed to understand human nature and human behavior, psychology. And besides, there were no decent methods around enable scientists to study the material mechanics of the mind. So mind data couldn't really be sidestepped. From Hegel, some of the German idealists that we heard about earlier, and many others, of course, came the opposite idea, that matter is really mind, or spirit, or idea. Naturally, though, it's hard to make such idealism the foundation for science, and especially for natural science, that treats observations of the natural world as its most precious empirical data. And that has, of course, been the case for very long periods, ever since Greek nature philosophy, Aristotle that we talked about earlier, via empiricism, the scientific revolution in astronomy, Enlightenment philosophy, Linnaeus and Darwin, all of these are kind of moves towards focusing on observables in the natural world. So you simply can't make idealism the paradigmatic point of departure for psychology and at the same time expect it to be taken seriously as a natural science, among others. To make matters worse, the same applies to the dualistic idea that both matter and mind are true ontological entities, but of very different kinds. So Descartes' substance dualism that we heard about earlier is the most well-known example. Bodies supposedly have extension in space. Minds have qualia, or thinking, as its constituent. And none should be understood or studied as the other. Dualism is often intuitively appealing, but in James's assessment, all philosophers who had subscribed to dualism had failed to make sense of the seemingly inextricable links that tie mental and physical processes to one another. For example, without a living body with its beating heart and its electrical brain, the person has no mental processes either. So they can't be completely different ontological processes after all. More than 2,000 years of intellectual debate had not been able to solve this problem. Pragmatism in philosophy is really a way of just breaking this kind of intellectual stalemate. It's as though James, Dewey, Pehr, and the others entered this scene as philosophy's equivalent of punk, like in rock and fashion, but perhaps with a little more style. To hell with it, they said, in effect. Stop quibbling about irresolvable metaphysical questions, like the mind-body problem, the nature of truth, and so on. Instead, try to find pragmatic solutions to them so that science can march on and provide instrumental knowledge that aids society and humans. With that particular attitude as a backdrop, James adopts a position on the mind-body problem that was later labeled neutral monism by Bertrand Russell, who essentially also adopted James's position. The idea is quite simple. Mind and body are non-reducible manifestations of the same underlying reality, which is understood as neutral with respect to substance. So mind and body both represent genuine facets of reality. The one cannot be reduced to the other, and yet they're both bound by the same underlying reality. Others may be more familiar with the double aspect theory in philosophy. It's a very similar but not identical idea. In any event, James's position enables him here to sidestep the pitfalls of materialism, idealism, and dualism at the same time, while also legitimizing for psychology to study mind beyond matter. And this turned out to be a very important move. Without it, we probably wouldn't have phenomenology. Indeed, Husserl gives a lot of credit to James. Similarly, we wouldn't have been able to sanction for psychologists to show an active interest in people's lived experience, nor how such experience is tied, but again not reducible to physical processes. And James himself would not have been able to formulate his classical theory of emotion, where he basically proposes that emotions stem from people's interpretation, so that's a kind of cognitive process, of physical sensations, or physical arousal to be more precise. Nor would he have been able to delve into religious and mystical experiences. He rightly viewed these as often representing transformative turning points in people's lives, usually but not always for the better, and of course just with a pragmatic eye to the experience and their fruits, rather than anything about metaphysics or God. Naturally, neutral monism is not without critics. For example, what is the ontological nature of the neutral that gives rise to both matter and mind? And this is quite ironic, because the pragmatists never claimed that they solved any metaphysical questions. They just dodged or removed them, instead suggesting a kind of pragmatic point of departure so they could move on with other more fruitful things. This hasn't prevented those who are metaphysically inclined to continue to show an interest in that question, of course, and so they get back at people like James. And some folks are even bold and delusionary enough to propose new solutions to the mind-body problem, suggesting some novel materialistic or esoteric idea that gives them roughly 15 minutes of fame, and then the world moves on with other ideas. On and on that process goes, ad infinitum, even after pragmatism. So I would like to end by discussing two of those bold but delusionary ideas. Identity theory, which is a materialist theory about the mind as basically neural structures. There was a lot of enthusiasm for that, especially in the 1990s. It's just that people were unable to show that there were specific neural processes associated with specific mind states. So the idea has now been replaced by functional networks instead, and that is a much better idea, I think. But at the same time, it's bound to fail because each person's brain development differs from the other person's. And also because cognitive processes aren't merely ingrained, but also extended and cultured, embedded, and so forth. Panpsychism is another example. All things have a mind. When I reflected on that, it just struck me, but my belt never shows any sign of pain when I whip myself, whereas I apparently do, people say. And there's also a problem that even if the belt would have some mentation, it will semantically dilute what the term mentation means, so it doesn't seem very pragmatic, and it's not falsifiable. So just very briefly on behaviorism. Sometimes James is held accountable for behaviorism, but I think that's a grave misunderstanding of him, because neutral monism is really not compatible with behaviorism. Behaviorism is physiology plus behavior, right? Whereas James is a radical empiricist, but he also says experience is very important and other kinds of mind data, and that shouldn't be reduced to either physiology or behavior, just for the record. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to behaviorism later in this session. Did James work as a general practitioner in psychology?
No, no.
So why don't we just rather describe him as a philosopher? Why is he described as a psychologist?
I think because he was quite foundational in moving philosophy of the mind to science. And this is also why, I mean, he was founded in physiology, and he used philosophy, I guess, principles in philosophy, and the study of physiology to move into the scientific study of psychology. And many of his theories about psychology are actually specific enough so that they can be tested. For example, the theory of emotion that I mentioned. Also, his ideas on mystical experiences and their fruit generated a lot of scientific research. And that's all what pragmatism was about, was to take philosophy and make empirical questions out of it, basically.
It's interesting to us Swedes to realize the importance of Swedenborg. We regard him mainly as a crackpot who spent 14 hours a day sleeping with the angels. He must be very important outside Sweden.
Yeah. Obviously, he obviously is. Not so much for James. His father was into Swedenborg. James was more keen, I think, on the German romantics, basically.